crimes that expose the failures of everyone who should have protected a child. There are crimes that reveal how many people can know something terrible is happening and still do nothing. And there are crimes so systematic in their cruelty that they force us to ask how an entire neighborhood, an entire system, an entire community can fail one person so completely. This is the story of a 16-year-old girl who was left in the care of someone her parents trusted. What happened over the next 3 months would become one of the most significant cases in American child protection history, not because of what one person did, but because of how many people knew and looked away. Her name was Sylvia Likens, and Indianapolis, Indiana would never forget how badly it failed her. Sylvia Likens was not supposed to be a victim. She was a carnival worker's daughter, accustomed to temporary living situations and frequent moves. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, traveled the Midwest working carnival circuits. They needed stability for their daughters while they worked the summer season of 1965. They found what they thought was a solution in Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude was a 45-year-old mother of 7 children living on East New York Street in Indianapolis. She had responded to an inquiry about boarding, $20 per week for both Sylvia and her younger sister, Jenny. The arrangement seemed reasonable. Gertrude presented herself as a struggling but respectable widow trying to make ends meet. She had children of similar ages. The house was modest but clean. Lester and Betty believed their daughters would be safe there. They were catastrophically wrong. The Likens parents left Indianapolis in early July of 1965, believing they had secured appropriate care for their daughters. They would return in October to retrieve them. 3 months. A standard arrangement for carnival families. They had done this before. Nothing had ever gone wrong. But Gertrude Baniszewski was not what she appeared to be. She was a woman whose life had collapsed in stages. 3 failed marriages, 7 children from multiple fathers, chronic asthma that left her weak and dependent on her older children for household management, no steady income beyond sporadic ironing work and the occasional welfare check, and something darker that no intake interview or background check would have revealed in 1965 because such protections did not exist yet. She enjoyed hurting people weaker than herself. The first week passed normally. Sylvia and Jenny attended Arsenal Technical High School. They helped with household chores. They wrote letters home describing their new situation in positive terms because they had been raised to be polite and grateful. Nothing in those early days suggested what was coming. Then the first payment was late. Lester Likens was supposed to send $20 every Friday. 1 week, the money did not arrive on time. It came a few days late due to a postal delay, but Gertrude Baniszewski decided that the late payment was a personal insult, an excuse to punish someone who could not fight back. She started with Sylvia. What began as verbal abuse quickly became physical violence. Gertrude slapped Sylvia across the face for perceived disrespect, accused her of stealing food from the kitchen, called her names that no adult should use toward a child, but this was still within the range of what passed for harsh discipline in some households in 1965. Troubling, but not yet criminal. Then Gertrude discovered that Sylvia had shared a rumor at school, a thoughtless piece of teenage gossip suggesting that 2 of Gertrude's daughters had been with boys. The rumor may not have even been true, but Gertrude used it as justification for what came next. She decided that Sylvia needed to be taught a lesson about spreading lies. The punishment began with beatings, not disciplinary spankings, but sustained assaults with fists and wooden paddles. Gertrude's own children joined in. Paula Baniszewski, 17 years old and pregnant, punched Sylvia so hard she broke her wrist. The injury would show in the autopsy photographs months later, but nobody outside that house knew about it because Sylvia was no longer allowed to attend school. Gertrude told the school that Sylvia had run away. The school accepted this explanation without investigation because students from transient families disappeared frequently. Nobody checked. Nobody followed up. The system that was supposed to protect children simply accepted that a 16-year-old girl had vanished and moved on. But Sylvia had not run away. She was being held captive in the basement of the house on East New York Street. What happened in that basement over the next 2 months would be documented in court testimony so disturbing that the judge would eventually restrict public access to portions of the trial record. Not because the facts were disputed, but because they were too brutal for general consumption. Gertrude began inviting neighborhood children into the house to participate in what she called Sylvia's punishment. She framed it as justice for a girl who told lies and needed to learn respect. She made it a game, offered children money to hurt Sylvia, gave them Coca-Cola as rewards for creative cruelty. Court records would eventually document that more than a dozen different children participated directly. More knew and said nothing. The torture became a neighborhood secret that everyone shared and nobody reported. They burned her with cigarettes, more than 100 times across her body. They held lit matches to her skin and laughed when she flinched. They carved words into her stomach with a heated needle. The word they chose was crude and vicious, a label meant to degrade her. The process took hours spread across multiple sessions because the needle had to be reheated repeatedly. Sylvia's sister Jenny watched much of this happen. She was 12 years old, walking with leg braces due to polio, and terrified that if she told anyone or tried to help, she would be next. So she stayed silent because survival instinct in a child overrides everything else. The adults who saw evidence of abuse also stayed silent. A minister visited the Baniszewski home and saw Sylvia covered in bruises. He did nothing. A neighbor heard screaming through the walls. She did nothing. A police officer responding to an unrelated call noticed a malnourished girl with visible injuries. He accepted Gertrude's explanation that Sylvia was a troubled runaway who inflicted injuries on herself. He filed no report. This was not unusual for 1965. Child abuse was considered a private family matter. Teachers, doctors, clergy, and police had no legal obligation to report suspected abuse. The systems that would eventually mandate reporting did not exist yet. Children like Sylvia fell through gaps that were not considered gaps at all, but simply the way society functioned. By mid-October, Sylvia could barely walk. The combination of malnutrition, infected wounds, and repeated trauma had left her skeletal and weak. She had been given almost no food for weeks, forced to eat her own waste on at least one occasion, burned with boiling water, beaten with boards until bones cracked, forced into a bathtub of scalding water that caused second-degree burns across large portions of her body. Gertrude and her children forced Sylvia to write a letter describing how she had been kidnapped by a gang of boys who had done terrible things to her. The letter was meant to serve as Gertrude's alibi when the injuries inevitably came to light. It described abuse but attributed it to fictional perpetrators. Gertrude planned to claim that Sylvia had been attacked elsewhere and brought back to the house already injured. But Sylvia never finished the letter because on October 26, 1965, her body finally gave out. The exact cause of death would later be listed as brain swelling from repeated trauma and shock from extensive injuries, but there was no single fatal blow. She had been dying incrementally for weeks. Her body had simply reached the limit of what it could endure. When she stopped breathing, Gertrude panicked. Her carefully constructed narrative required a living victim who could supposedly identify her fictional attackers. A dead body required explanations that would invite investigation. She sent Richard Hobbs, a teenage neighbor who had participated in the abuse, to call police from a nearby payphone. She instructed him to report that an injured girl had been found at the address. She cleaned Sylvia's body and attempted to arrange the scene to match her false narrative. But when police arrived and saw the extent of the injuries, they knew immediately that no gang attack explained what they were seeing. The patterns were wrong, the injuries too numerous and systematic, the carved words too deliberate. They arrested Gertrude Baniszewski within hours. What police found when they processed the scene would become a turning point in how Indiana handled child abuse cases. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs documented more than 150 distinct injuries, burn marks, carved words, bruises in various stages of healing indicating sustained abuse over time, malnutrition so severe that Sylvia weighed barely 70 pounds at death. But more disturbing than the physical evidence was the witness testimony. When police interviewed the children who lived in the house and the neighborhood children who had participated, they discovered that the abuse had been an open secret. Paula Baniszewski admitted to hitting Sylvia repeatedly. Stephanie Baniszewski described holding Sylvia down while others burned her. Coy Hubbard, a teenage boy who had dated Stephanie, admitted to using Sylvia for judo practice, throwing her against walls and floors. Richard Hobbs described how he had carved the words into Sylvia's stomach at Gertrude's instruction. John Baniszewski Jr., who was 12 years old, admitted to burning Sylvia with cigarettes because his mother gave him money to do it. And Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, testified about everything she had witnessed while being powerless to stop it. The case presented a legal question that Indiana had never fully confronted. How do you prosecute torture that involved not one perpetrator but an entire household and neighborhood? How do you assign culpability when a dozen different people participated at different levels? The Marion County Prosecutor's Office decided to charge Gertrude Baniszewski with first-degree murder. They charged Paula Baniszewski, Stephanie Baniszewski, Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. as co-defendants, with varying levels of culpability based on their actions and ages. The trial began in April of 1966 and became a media sensation. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings. Courtroom spectators lined up hours early for seats. The testimony was so graphic that multiple jurors required breaks. the physical evidence so disturbing that even experienced investigators struggled to maintain composure. The defense attempted to argue that Gertrude Baniszewski was mentally ill and therefore not responsible for her actions. Psychiatrists testified about her difficult life circumstances and mental state, but prosecutors successfully argued that her actions demonstrated clear planning and awareness of wrongdoing. She had constructed an elaborate cover story. She had threatened witnesses into silence. She had hidden evidence. These were not the actions of someone incapable of understanding right from wrong. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts. Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula Baniszewski was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The teenage co-defendants received varying sentences based on their level of participation. John Baniszewski Jr., who was only 12 at the time of the abuse, was placed in juvenile custody. But the verdicts did not address the larger question that haunted everyone who studied the case. How had this been allowed to happen for months in a house surrounded by neighbors, with children coming and going, in a neighborhood where people saw and heard evidence of abuse? The Sylvia Likens case became a catalyst for legal reform in Indiana and across the United States. The public outrage over how many people had known about the abuse without reporting it forced lawmakers to confront gaps in child protection systems. In 1967, Indiana passed some of the country's first mandatory reporting laws, requiring teachers, doctors, social workers, and other professionals to report suspected child abuse to authorities. Other states followed with similar legislation throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. The case also changed how police and prosecutors approached child abuse investigations. Before Sylvia Likens, abuse cases were often treated as misdemeanors or family disputes. After her death, serious child abuse cases began to be prosecuted as felonies with significant prison sentences. Gertrude Baniszewski served 20 years in prison before being paroled in 1985, despite widespread public opposition. She moved to Iowa under a new name and lived quietly until her death from lung cancer in 1990. She gave only one interview in which she claimed to have no memory of the abuse, attributing it to mental illness and blackouts. Paula Baniszewski was paroled in 1972 after serving only 5 years. She changed her name and moved away from Indiana. She died in 2012. The teenage co-defendants served their sentences and were released. Most disappeared into quiet lives under new identities. Some struggled with guilt. Others reportedly showed no remorse. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister who had witnessed the abuse, struggled with survivor's guilt for the rest of her life. She testified at multiple parole hearings opposing the release of those convicted. She spoke publicly about the case in later years, advocating for stronger child protection laws. She died in 2004 at age 54. Sylvia's parents, Lester and Betty Likens, divorced shortly after their daughter's death. Both struggled with the knowledge that they had left their children in a situation that turned deadly. Lester died in 2001. Betty died in 1998. The house on East New York Street in Indianapolis where the abuse occurred still stands. It has changed hands multiple times. Some owners have reported difficulty selling it due to its history. The neighborhood around it has changed dramatically, but people who lived there in 1965 still remember the trial and the questions it raised about collective responsibility. The Sylvia Likens case exposes uncomfortable truths about how societies fail vulnerable people. It demonstrates that evil does not require monsters. It requires ordinary people making decisions to look away, to not get involved, to assume someone else will handle it. More than a dozen children participated in or witnessed Sylvia's abuse. Not one told a parent or teacher or police officer until after she was dead. Some feared retaliation. Some thought it was not their business. Some believed adults would not take them seriously. All of those fears were probably justified based on how 1960s society functioned, but their silence created the conditions for torture to continue for 3 months. The adults who saw evidence of abuse also failed. The minister who saw bruises, the neighbor who heard screaming, the police officer who saw visible injuries, all had reasons for not acting that made sense within the context of their time. Child abuse was a private family matter. Police had limited authority to intervene. Mandatory reporting did not exist, but their inaction allowed a child to die. The systems that should have protected Sylvia were not designed with her protection in mind. Schools did not track truancy aggressively. Welfare departments did not conduct home visits. Police did not investigate child welfare complaints with the same seriousness as property crimes. These were not oversights. They were reflections of how society viewed children as property of their guardians with limited, independent rights. Sylvia Likens died because 1965 Indiana did not have the legal or cultural infrastructure to save her. The reforms that followed her death created some of that infrastructure: mandatory reporting laws, child protective services, foster care regulations, abuse hotlines. These systems are imperfect and still fail children regularly, but they exist because Sylvia Likens died, and people decided that what happened to her should never happen again. The Sylvia Likens case is not ancient history. It happened within living memory. Some of the people involved are still alive today. The house still stands. The court records are still accessible to researchers studying child protection policy, and the conditions that allowed it to happen still exist in modified forms. Children still fall through gaps in protective systems. Abuse still goes unreported because witnesses assume someone else will act. Mandatory reporting laws still depend on adults recognizing abuse and having the courage to report it. Child protective services are still overwhelmed and underfunded in most jurisdictions. The question is not whether something similar could happen today. The question is whether it is happening right now in households where neighbors hear things they choose not to investigate. In schools where teachers see warning signs they talk themselves out of reporting. In communities where everyone knows a child is in danger but nobody wants to be the one to get involved. Sylvia Likens died because an entire community decided her suffering was not their responsibility. She died because systems designed to protect children treated them as secondary concerns. She died because the people who could have saved her chose silence. And every time someone sees evidence of child abuse and decides it is not their business, they make the same choice that killed Sylvia Likens in 1965. The difference is that now, most of us have no excuse. The systems exist. The laws require reporting. The infrastructure is in place. All that remains is the willingness to use it. Sylvia Marie Likens was 16 years old when she died. She should have graduated high school, should have built a life beyond the carnival circuits, should have had the chance to become whoever she was meant to be. Instead, she became the reason Indiana changed its laws, the case that forced America to confront how easily children can disappear in plain sight, the name that reminds us that looking away is never neutral, because evil does not require active participation. Sometimes it only requires people who see something terrible happening and decide it is not their problem. And in Indianapolis, Indiana, in 1965, that was enough to torture a girl to death while an entire neighborhood watched.